Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. I'm Tigress Osborn. I'm the Executive Director of NAAFA, the National Association to Advance FAT Acceptance. And welcome to the NAAFA Webinar Series. We are super excited to have our friend Aubrey Gordon joining us today to talk about fat friends and herself as your fat friend and all the other fat friends and all things fat. Before we get into it with Aubrey, I just want to remind you that any of the views and thoughts and opinions that you hear today during this video are attributed solely to their respective speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the National Association to Advance FAT Acceptance. I would also like to introduce you to our friends from Pro Bono ASL. They do important accessibility work virtually all over the world. Our interpreters today are David and Marbella, and you can learn more about Pro Bono ASL and their work at probonoasl.com. You can also learn more about NAAFA at our website, NAAFA.org. If this is your first time ever attending a NAAFA event or you're new to learning about our organization, we were founded in 1969, and since then we've been doing education, advocacy, and support in the name of ending size discrimination and changing perceptions of fat. So let's get into doing that a little bit with our special guest, Aubrey. Aubrey, rather than read your bio, may I just ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Aubrey Gordon. I am the co-host of a podcast called Maintenance Phase. I've written 2 books with very long titles that we're just going to skate right by. And am the subject of a new documentary, Your Fat Friend.
Where can people find your books?
Wherever you get your books. They're called You Just Need to Lose Weight and 19 Other Myths About Fat People and What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat. And I am lobbying hard for my next book title to be like 2 words.
I know. Before my NAAFA life, I ran an organization called Full Figure Entertainment, which had a super long website because it was that whole thing. Yep. And now National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance it would be so much easier if we were just called like Fat Group, but here we are. So welcome to the Fat Group.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Fat Group Webinar Series. Thank you all so much for being here. We do encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat if you are here with us live today. Be sure to tell folks where you're coming in from and whose land that is. If you don't know anything about the indigenous folks of the place that you live, we encourage you to look that up, learn more about those communities, and support those communities. And even though we're meeting in virtual space, we hope that you will all share that a little bit with each other, those of you who are here with us live. Aubrey, where in the world are you?
I am in Portland, Oregon, on the ancestral lands of the Multnomah and Chinook tribes. And actually, I will say, the Chinook tribe right now is in an active campaign for federal recognition. There are many, many, many tribes that have no federal recognition. So there's like also stuff you can do to show up for tribes and to help them, again, gain resources, gain federal recognition, get all of the stuff that comes along with that. So yeah, that's where I am. How about you? You're in somewhere not your usual stomping ground.
I'm not in my usual stomping grounds, but my usual stomping grounds are the greater Phoenix area. And where I live is the ancestral folks of where I live are the O'odham people. And of course, the state of Arizona is home to lots of federally recognized tribes and lots of other indigenous folks who, regardless of federal recognition, certainly deserve our love and support. Mm-hmm. And shout out to any of y'all folks who are with us today. So let's talk a little bit, Aubrey, let's just get into your origin story. For folks who don't know who you were before we knew you were Aubrey Gordon, tell us that story.
Sure. So prior to my life as a writer and podcaster, I spent about a dozen years as a community organizer, working on LGBT equality, particularly trans healthcare, immigrant rights, and advancing support for immigrant rights and LGBT communities. And voting rights were the big things that I focused on the most. And after quite some time of just like knocking on people's doors and being like, I'm gay. Do you think I should have anything? Is there anything you think I should have? I, as many folks do in the field, decided to move on. And I had been writing anonymously on the internet about my experiences as a fat lady. Over the course of several years and lots of tries and all kinds of stuff, wound up writing a book and releasing a podcast in the same year in 2020. And most of my work has focused on, my experience and the experiences of other fat people, particularly super fat and infinifat people. So we're talking about folks at the larger end of the size spectrum, right? And yeah, if there's an origin story to be had, I would say that Weight Watchers is like the radioactive spider that bit me. Like, not my particular favorite place, but also now I have powers, So yeah, that's what I would say is my origin story, from community organizing to writing and podcasting.
And before we knew you as Aubrey, the writer and podcaster, we just knew you as your fat friend.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I left out a big chapter.
Well, it's an important piece of the story, right? Like, so what made you write the first thing that you wrote anonymously on the internet as your fat friend? And what made you stay anonymous about it for so long?
I wrote the first thing initially was just a letter to a friend of mine, who I had really sort of struggled to meet in conversation. We were talking about sort of bodies and body image and eating disorders and all of that sort of stuff. And we were just missing each other, just ships passing in the night. We both had eating disorders, but this friend was a thin person and I was a fat person. And I was trying and sort of failing to explain that, the treatment standards around, for instance, anorexia nervosa are really deeply messed up and exclude people like me. And also that she and I were having different experiences of our eating disorders and of our bodies because of the size of those bodies. And I think that was sort of hard for her to grasp onto because it wasn't her image of herself or her community or the world that she wants to live in, right? And it's hard to hear that folks with different identities and gender presentations and all kinds of things are having different experiences than you might be having, right? It's hard to take that on board, and especially hard when you realize you might have been witnessing it or even doing it and not stepping in when it happened. So I wrote that letter to her. I sent it to a friend of mine to proofread it and sort of make sure I wasn't being a total jerk to this other friend. And his suggestion was, yeah, no, it's fine to send to your friend. And also, you should post this somewhere, and
he should send it to the rest of our friends.
You should send it to the internet, because I think there are a lot of people who would get a lot out of this, right?
Yeah.
I was sort of two minds about names. When I first registered, I didn't realize that your member name on Medium was also going to be the link to all of your Medium stories forever. So my name on Medium is technically The Fat Shadow, which has long been my joke about what my superhero name would be. Also super villain. It honestly works either way.
I might want to go back to what the costume for the Fat Shadow super villain would be, but please continue.
Sure. It was inspired, I will say, by I went through a phase of taking lots of profile pictures of my shadow, which just always looked like the intro to Alfred Hitchcock Presents to me. Just a little fat little profile. And I picked your fat friend sort of out of a hat, not literally, but figuratively, because it seemed like, I wanted to sort of come at that writing project from the space of like a friend who wants you to grow, not a person who's really, really angry with you, not a teacher who's there to answer a bunch of questions, not any of that sort of stuff. But I wanted to do writing that was sort of corrective, that was aimed at people who are not fat and have not been fat, and do it in a way that felt supportive and sort of held their hand through a bunch of stuff that frankly, lots of other fat people that I knew did not want to hold their hands through. And I felt like
Yeah.
after all that organizing, I was like, well, I have a weirdly huge stamina for this nonsense. This seems like a way I could take one for the team. Um, so that is where my work has been focused most frequently, is sort of on um, that sort of entry point to the conversation that helps folks understand the stakes and how to engage and all of that kind of stuff.
Let's talk a little bit about what you just said about sort of taking one for the team. Like, what does it mean to be recognizable on the internet, especially now that you've come out with your real name?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be recognizable as like one of the people who speaks for the fats?
Boy, I mean, listen, especially as an organizer, I just think any of those models where one person, and like it's usually a white person and it's usually a cis person and it's usually a non-disabled person, um, is like speaking on behalf of any single community, is like not a functional way to run things. I was just talking to a friend of yours and mine about this the other day, Virginia Soulsmith. We were
Mhm.
talking about sort of you know how hard sorry, media tries to really hone in on a single person or a single leader, and usually they focus on the people whose work they grasp the most easily. So I feel like a lot of my work at this point is to you know do media and promotion of projects, all that kind of stuff. But for the rest of it, when people are just like, what do fat people think about this thing? To make sure that that goes to other experts in the field, because there are a ton of us, and a lot of media likes to depict us as A, fringe, and B, like 3 people. So the more we can break that up, the better. Yeah.
Yeah, whenever we get media outreach at NAAFA, what I try to do in talking to those folks is make sure that I name anywhere from 3 to 10 other people that they
Yep,
should talk
totally.
to. Because you're absolutely right. And for folks who don't know Virginia Soulsmith's work, she is the author of Fat Talk, which is a book about parenting fat children, and the host of the Burnt Toast podcast. Aubrey, what do we not talk about when we talk about that?
I mean, I think there's like 2 sets of conversations there, right? There's like the in community conversation about like, what are we not talking about in community? That's a different thing. The book that I wrote was sort of aimed at more of a dominant culture sort of narrative of fatness and fat people, which sort of insists that fatness is inherently medical and requires a medical solution, insists that fatness is inherently undesirable, and that one cannot desire fat people and fat people cannot be loved, which I would say is one of the most brutal sort of emotional things you could say about a community of people, is no one will love you. Woof. And it's a thing that people routinely say about fat people.
Mhm.
We don't talk about access and accessibility. I think I have particularly had gnarly access experiences on planes, but just about every fat person I know has had terrible experiences with the size of bathroom stalls or theater seats or like any number of things, right? The built environment is not a natural fact of the world around us. It is the consequence of human decisions. And the humans who made those decisions either didn't think about us or decided they didn't need to think about us in designing a lot of stuff. I mean, I think the other thing that feels like a huge part of the conversation that is missing, which I'm so grateful to you all for tackling, um, is just the sort of blatant, overt, and constant discrimination that fat folks face. A lot of folks may not know this, but unless you specifically list out a category or a community of people, that sort of aspect of your identity or experience is not protected from discrimination, right? Fat people, they call it enumerating protected classes, is the sort of legal terminology, policy terminology for it. And I'm so incredibly grateful to NAAFA for spearheading so much of that work to make fat folks an enumerated, protected class from the kind of employment discrimination that like way too many of us have faced.
Yeah, we haven't, I mean, we see in our work a tendency for people to, for people who are outside of the advocacy work to think about anti-fatness as like just an interpersonal issue. Like just you know, do you get along with people? Do people on dating apps think you're attractive? Do, you know, are people friendly to you at work, but not like, are people creating a hostile environment at your job that prevents you from doing your best work or from, you know, excelling in your job or being paid fairly in your job? And so that systemic piece, I think, feels really important. And I'm wondering what, like, in the years that you've been doing this, both anonymously and then after you know, came out publicly under your own name, what are some of the aha moments that you've seen from people who like didn't seem to get this stuff and seem to be getting it a little better?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm also going to turn that back on you in a minute because I feel like you will probably also have had a number of them. And I'm super curious about how that pops up in your work at NAAFA. I would say the biggest one that really seems to kind of break people's brains in like a productive direction is talking about the history of the BMI and talking about the history of how medical institutions came to define quote unquote obesity as a quote unquote disease, right? That both of those are so thoroughly constructed that they seem very natural to folks now. And folks don't necessarily see that, like, you know, the BMI, I think it's now much more common knowledge than it used to be, but the BMI was invented by someone who was not a physician, was not designing it for a healthcare context, but was an astronomer and statistician drawing his data from white dudes in the military in the 1800s, right? Like, so if you're not a white dude,
everyone should be measured according to them.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we should definitely determine people's access to healthcare based on that and all kinds of stuff. Right. And I think the other one is that sort of construction of fatness as a disease stuff, which has come about in the last 20-ish years. And folks don't necessarily know that, like, the American Medical Association voted to redefine fatness as a disease against the recommendation of their own in-house experts and their own research committee, right?
Yeah.
But like just making visible how much debate there has been on these topics that people treat as hard and fast, concrete knowledge feels like a really important pathway for folks to develop a little bit of a deeper understanding. It's very frustrating, I will say, to have to like do all of this research and give people like an in-depth, like, you know, university lecture to get them to the point of just believing fat people when we say things are tough, right? And actually just like listening to us and hearing out our experiences. But it's also sort of like where we're at. And I don't really see a ton of non-fat people stepping up to the plate to take on that work, right? So until then, it sort of falls to us. How about you? Tell me about aha moments.
Well, I think just the fact of the piece around what is not covered by legal protections, I think is a really big aha moment for a lot of people, because I think a lot of people, especially in a US context, a lot of people just assume that if something unfair happens to you, you can sue someone over it. And you can, but if there are not explicit protections around the thing that you are trying to sue about, then it becomes much harder to win such a lawsuit or even get it heard. And so when people just sort of have a sense, I think, especially around employment stuff, that like, what do you mean your boss is not paying you the same thing just because you're fatter than another coworker? Well, of course you can sue them for that. I mean, you can try.
Yeah, totally.
You can try. And so I think that is one of the things that, like, when people kind of go like, wait, what? There's only how many places where that's illegal? Yeah. Why wouldn't it be illegal? I think even people who don't like fat people, right? Like even as we see sort of research indicating that trends towards anti-fatness are on an upward swing, we still also see research indicating that people want to see these protections under the law. So like maybe people think like, like, content warning, I'm gonna say bad things about fat people, but like maybe people think fat people are ugly and I don't want to date them, but they don't necessarily think that means your boss doesn't have to pay you fairly for your job. And so, or even people who are dealing with their own internalized anti-fatness. I don't want to be fat, but that doesn't mean I want fat people to be treated poorly in the world, right? And those things are all interconnected, but it is one of the sort of aha spaces that we see a lot at NAAFA and that I see a lot as I'm interacting with people, that sort of like, wait, what? It's only a few places in the world where you can't just blatantly discriminate against people. And then I do think the one that you mentioned about the sort of the AMA decision is just always, that is a really fun one to drop on people who are just like, well, everybody knows we've always said, and like, actually, no. And, we get accused a lot. I get accused a lot of being like a science denier, and I'm not a science denier. Like, I'm actually interested in more accurate science. And so, when you talk about things that are like, there are, medical devices or, for example, very, very popular weight loss drugs that haven't really been tested on fat people or haven't been adequately tested on fat people, or so many populations of the people who are more likely to be fat have been excluded in one way or another from the research that, like, who are we even doing research on? So we have research that's harder to fund if it's about approaches that are not how we're going to find the next magic pill to weight loss or whatever. And then we have just the internalized, or the inherent bias of researchers that they are going to bring to their work, even when they are working really hard to mitigate their own bias, but especially when they just believe they don't have any. They can just believe like everything negative about fat people is facts. That's not a bias of mine. That's just facts, right? But then also just the sort of like, do we even let fat people be part of that process? Do we don't let fat people give bodies to science. So you're not going to be a medical student learning things on a cadaver over a certain size, right? And we see research studies all the time where there's like a BMI cutoff to the research, but then the results are extrapolated to have something to do with what fat people should be doing to get under that BMI. And so that all of that kind of stuff is just this sort of like, if you could get people to pause for even a moment and turn off their everybody knows button and actually learn a new fact, like even one new fact that they didn't know already, I find that there are some like at least little like it's like Christmas lights, right? Like little light bulbs that start going off around some of these things. Yeah.
I mean, to paraphrase my friend and co-host Michael Hobbs, it's really telling what we don't need evidence to believe. And most of us don't need evidence to believe that fat people are unhealthy or going to die or going to all of these different things, right? And that feels like a real cornerstone of anti-fatness is what you're calling like the everybody knows button, right? That's really well put. Really, really well.
I think it's Reagan Chastain who said like you can't show up to an evidence fight with everybody knows. But that is one of the things that we see all the time as advocates for fat people is like on the other side, they can show up with everybody knows and they just get to see I'm supposed to have like, an annotated bibliography of everything I ever reference. And in the end, what it all comes down to is I don't in some ways, I don't care at all why fat people are fat, right? Like I care about that if there are systemic things that are causing that, if there's like systemic oppression that is affecting people in their access to whatever, like, yes, I care about it as a systemic issue, but like on an individual level, even when people trot out their stereotypes of like, oh, if you didn't eat McDonald's all different, I don't care if you're the single person keeping a fast food chain in business, not that one for other reasons, but like, I don't care about that when I'm talking about whether you deserve civil rights or not. Right. And so I don't feel like I have a responsibility to show up with like an encyclopedia full of medical research to prove whatever I'm saying about fat and health, because what I'm saying is we need to be asking more questions, and we need to be separating this from the issues of civil rights. But for folks who do want to show up with an annotated bibliography, you do the research. What is it like to have a job where you are steeped so often in this really traumatic research about fat people? Like when you're just when like other fat people were like, I don't want to live in a world where I even have to hear the word obesity, and you're like, I'm going to read 20 hours worth of research this week about obesity.
And they're all going to say that word 30 times on every page. Yes. Just in total candor, the internet's a good place for that, right? In total candor, I will say I have been having sort of more and more days lately where I'm like, this is a lot to handle. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just a lot to hold. And it's a lot also to sort of step into the mindset of people who are predisposed not to believe us, right? And not to hear us out and not to all these other sort of things, right? So like, to your earlier point, I also could not care less why different people are fat. And so many people are so sure that fat people just need to put down the cheeseburger that someone's got to be like, hey, PCOS is also a thing. Hey, lipedema is also a thing. Hey, trauma ? That's a tricky one.
Hey, also, we ain't the only ones holding cheeseburgers.
Totally. And on top of all of that, we know for a fact that fat people have been around for a really long time. I would like to introduce you all to portraits of Henry VIII, right? Like, we have lots and lots of history of lots and lots of fat people. But we're sort of getting treated as this like modern contagion that has.
I always love that there were no. Sorry, use that thought.
No. Just that we're like new, right? That fat people are like a recent phenomenon.
I always love there were no fat people anecdotes from the trolls or from everybody. I mean, we recently saw this we were doing some testimony in Colorado related to some of the legislative work there that is about getting insurance companies to cover weight management and quote unquote treatments. We would call them weight cycling treatments and or weight suppression treatments. But we were doing some testimony there as we're trying to do some harm reduction around these bills by making sure that they have language in them that prevents medical, establishment from using BMI cutoffs or that has other language around discrimination. We're trying. But anyway, there's a person who shows up for a lot of the testimony there, just like regular person, because I don't know if you all know this. You don't have to be a national expert to testify in front of a government agency about something or in front of a government committee. And so when this work is being done where you live, you can be one of the people who is showing up to tell about your lived experience, even if you are not, don't have you're not a NAAFA or an Aubrey Gordon. But so anyway, just a regular person who shows up to tell us how her son is her cisgender, straight, white, male son is the true victim of bullying in the schools there. But also, in telling us that story, she reminds us that there were no fat children when she was in school. And it's just like, what that's just not true. Like whatever research or evidence shows about changing of human bodies and people are taller, people are fatter, people in these parts of the world are fatter, like all of that stuff is like, there are lots of different ways to sort of analyze that and talk about the trends of why that is. And certainly further stigmatizing weight has not slowed down any of those changes. So that's not what it is, right? Yeah. It's not like if we could just stigmatize fat people more, we wouldn't have more fat people. That's not working. So
we've been on that for my whole life. And I'm like, here to tell you just an N of one. Here.
Right. That's right.
To tell you.
But it's just so fascinating. Like, there were no fat children when I went to school. Like, do not make me look up your kindergarten class photo.
I will find
I will hire a private detective and look up your kindergarten class. Like, yes, there were fat, but also like if there were no fat kids in your school, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean there were no fat people on earth or even in your community. Right? We take all these moments where we kind of go, there weren't fat people there. And that's supposed to be like evidence that there were no fat people. Or maybe you were just excluding them. Like maybe the fat kid in your community didn't get to go to school, as is evidenced by real court cases, because the school wouldn't accommodate their fat body. So they had to be homeschooled. right? It doesn't, like, whatever. There are all kinds of reasons and explanations, but just the sort of like that whole thing of like, if I didn't see a fat person in a place where I was, that means no fat people on earth exist, despite the fact that we keep saying there are 93 million of them in one country alone.
It's just, it feels to me like, right, every conversation, every remark has text and subtext, right? And the subtext of that is, I wasn't expected to care what your experience was, and I wasn't expected to anticipate what your experience might be or engage with your needs in any real way. And this is really like messing with my self-image to have you say you actually haven't been thinking about this, right? Rather than just sort of taking it on board and going, oh, interesting, and sort of keeping your life rolling. Folks really sort of dig in their own resistance, because I think it feels like an identity sort of protective thing for folks, which keeps them from a much more productive conversation about like, hey, just like, let's just stipulate, yeah, things are different for fat people than they are for thin people, right? What do we do with that as like a simple fact? Like, what next, right?
Yeah.
Rather than litigating fat people are new, fat people are old, fat people are borrowed, fat people are blue, right? Like all of these different things, right?
Yeah, it's like the like, we exist, so there it is. Like, just act like we exist instead of acting like we don't or shouldn't. We do. Now what? Right? Now what? Yeah. What about how this all in your life ended up with you being the center of a documentary?
That is a thing that I said yes to within 6 months of starting to write anonymously. So Jeannie Finley, who's an absolutely brilliant documentarian and also a fat lady, I do not think I would have made this with anyone who was not a fat person. I just don't think that was in the cards for this guy. Jeannie Finley reached out and asked first if I was interested in writing a voiceover for an essay film that she was working on. And I was like, pardon me, the playwriting major would be more than happy to do some screenwriting. Don't mind if I do. And then some months later, that turned into, hey, would you consider being one of the subjects of this film? And then some months after that, it became, maybe even a couple of years after that, it became, are you up for being the subject of this film? And I had one of those moments where I was like, boy, I don't really know of a lot of media that's made by fat people about fat people, right? That like there are limited sort of auteur cases, like Nicole Byer getting to make Loosely Exactly Nicole. And like, you know, there are like little moments of that happen here and there, but like the opportunity to do that and to work with someone who is so incredibly skilled and sort of revered in her field felt like a huge opportunity. And it felt like an opportunity to see something other than like the three fat stories we've all become accustomed to seeing, which are like fat person loses weight and gains their life back is one of them. One is fat person doesn't lose weight and it's The Whale. That's that one. The second one is just The Whale.
Ooh.
Yeah, for sure, boo.
Yeah,
for sure. Deep, endless boo. Just assume I'm always booing The Whale and Weight Watchers.
I can barely say the name of that movie without adding explicit adjectives in front of the name of the movie. So like people in my life who didn't pay attention to that movie don't know that a movie called The Whale exists because they think it's called The Whale.
Yeah.
Like that's just part of the name of it.
That's the full title. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what's important too, one of the things that's important about what you just said about like making this film with not just with someone fat, but with someone fat who was interested in sort of like a fat liberation framework, or at least a sort of fat honesty framework, or like, you know, whatever.
Just a fat anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, like literally anything else.
Well, and we've seen some things come out in the last few years we've seen some pieces of media come out in the last few years that, you know, that look pretty interesting, but are funded by pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
or the organizations that sort of front for pharmaceutical companies. And so it does feel very different to have, like, even, you all debuted at Tribeca. Your US debut was at the Tribeca Film Festival last year. There was another fat movie at the Tribeca Film Festival, but it was part of one of the sort of advertising honors that the film festival gave.
Yeah.
And it was underwritten by Novo Nordisk. And so, that's more complicated for folks, right? That people have a lot of mixed feelings about whether that should or should not happen. But at a minimum, I will say that it's certainly more complicated for people to think about that as the source versus another fat person who's in community with us as the source.
Yeah. And someone who's not, having worked with publishers and all kinds of sort of like the sort of gatekeeping forces in the world of like entertainment and media and all of that kind of stuff. I think there was also a real serious asset to this being a completely independent production that was independently fundraised for, independently made, so that there wasn't like kind of whatever industry you're in, at some point, if you want to make a thing about fat people, you have to make all of the thin people up the chain feel comfortable with that. And it felt incredible to be like, oh, the decision makers are you and me. Cool, amazing. Only fat people are involved in this decision making. Incredible. So having that as an opportunity and knowing how incredibly rare of an opportunity that is just felt like a really just hard to turn down just because anyone was getting it. Do you know what I mean? Just because any fat person anywhere was being looked at as worthy of any kind of feature anything that was not about their weight loss or their sad limited life or how much they're rejected and a pariah or like any of those sort of stories that are mostly there to reinforce thin people's sense of accomplishment that they are not fat. They're not there to tell the stories of fat people, right?
Well, and what we always hear with those other kinds of projects is, well, but some fat people do feel that way, right? But we only tell the stories of the fat people who feel that way, and and only at the time that they feel that way. There are lots of fat people who have felt some of those ways along the course of their life. It's not the definitive feeling of their entire life, right? And so when do we hear people from other points on their timeline, or when do we hear from the other people? If there are, 1,000 movies at a film festival and 2 of them are about fat people, that's not representative of the millions of people around the world who are fat, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I want to have you tell folks a little bit about how they can see the movie. And while you're doing that, for those of you who are here with us live, we can take a couple of questions from the audience for Aubrey, and you can put your questions into the chat. It's super helpful if you just put the word question in front of it in capital letters, so that if the chat starts popping off, it's easy for me to still see the questions. And so queue up a couple questions from Aubrey that don't come from me. I can't promise that we'll get to all of them. Go ahead and start putting things in. And while they do that, Aubrey, tell them how they can see this film.
So starting tomorrow, May 1st, May Day, Workers of the World Unite, May Day. Starting tomorrow, you can see the film for the entire month of May at jolt.film. It's a sliding scale ticket. So it's a pay what you can / what you'd like, depending on where you're at. You can stream it almost anywhere in the world. If you can't stream it there, that's because there's about to be like a theatrical or broadcast release. So it's coming for you either way. And before you do any of that, listen, tomorrow doesn't start for another 8 hours, 9 hours, something like that. Before you do all that, please, dear God, go to NAAFA.org and sign the petition for the Campaign for Size Freedom, so that you will know when NAAFA is in your town or in your state working on non-discrimination protections. Please do that. Please do that. Yeah. And then tomorrow, it's a new day. Your thing to do for tomorrow is go watch the film at jolt.film.
Yes, and if you're trying to go to that petition right now, it's naafa.org/size freedom. One of our NAAFA team will drop it in the chat for you if you're here with us right now. And of course, if you want to support our work by giving to NAAFA, you can do that on our website as well. at just click on the big old give button. On May 1st, we are also launching something which is a month-long campaign in which we have a very generous donor who has agreed to give us $100 for every person that signs up at any amount to be a monthly donor. So you can join our brand new NAAFA pod. That is our passionate, ongoing donors group. And you can join the NAAFA pod starting tomorrow, and then we'll get $100 for every one of you that do. So please do that as well.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Tomorrow.
So let's thank you, Aubrey.
Sure.
So you heard it, folks. Aubrey's going to try to be first. So see if you can beat.
I'm doing the thing on YouTube where people just go first. That's me right now. That's right.
So I'm going to try to combine a couple of the questions that have at least similar spirit or similar content so we can get to a few before we run out of time. There are a few questions about sort of like the process of making the film and what you're most hesitant about addressing in the movie. What felt vulnerable for you about making this and what was surprising for you about the process?
I will say what felt vulnerable to me about making this was every minute of it. Felt really vulnerable. Jeannie and I have become close through the process of filming. But ultimately, this was somebody who followed me around with a camera for 7 years, I think, 6 or 7 years, and has just hundreds of hours of me in various states of mental health and various states of career development and having good ideas and bad ideas all on camera and lots of interactions with my parents. So just every single part of it, I think, until I saw the rough cut, which was also the final cut. I think it just felt like really deeply, majorly vulnerable and like I was falling and hadn't hit yet, like just falling and hadn't hit the ground or landed or like hit a crash pad or whatever.
So now that some of that is out in the world, how does it feel to see people's responses to all that vulnerability?
It feels really good. I mean, I think the number of fat people who have said, God, there were parts of this that really resonated with me, not because they were new to me, but because it was new to see them on screen, feels so incredibly impactful. The number of people who've written in and said, I saw the film and I apologized to my kid for how I treated them as a fat kid feels really huge, like really huge. So yeah, I mean, I think it still feels very vulnerable. It still feels like a lot. And also it feels like it's worth it if that's what people are taking away from it. Like, yeah, let's do it.
What recommendations do you have on content for content creators in the area of fatness and sexuality, inclusive of all of the LGBTQIA plus, inclusive of sexuality of that community?
Oh,
what do we not talk about when we talk about fat and sex?
Fat queers and sex. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so I would say there are plenty of like incredible fat folks who are doing work around fatness and sexuality. The folks at Big Sexy Chat are the first folks who spring to mind for me, but there are many, many, many more. And I would like strongly recommend engaging with fat folks who are doing the work themselves, because if you're not a fat person, you can make a lot of guesses, but they're gonna be guesses, right? And they may or may not be materially helpful thing. And I would say, if you're guessing and you have not been fat, chances are fat people have also made that guess and tried that thing. So I would say, very helpful to talk to folks who've been trying to sort of crack that particular nut, so to speak.
To bust that particular nut?
As soon as I said it, I was like, yeah, that's what I would say, is work directly with fat folks in the space, and also engage with fat sex workers and fat trans people who are experiencing like really specific intersections of pressure and discrimination and bias and all kinds of stuff.
Well, and I think that's like that more broadly is also just good advice about like look for the fat people who are doing the thing. Don't ask, don't look for the research about fat people doing the thing. That's helpful. Like all the academic pieces are just like super important. And also the lived experience pieces are super important. And expertise does not only look like I studied hundreds of people. It also can look like I built a career as an organizer. I am a sex worker myself, or I'm a sex educator myself. I am a fat chef. Let me tell you about what it's like to navigate a kitchen as a fat chef. I'm a fat scientist. Let me tell you what it's like to be in the lab. Like, look for the fat people who are doing it. Because there are some. They might be limited in number, but they are
everywhere.
Some.
We are everywhere. We're in every field. We're in every location. We're all over the place. Yeah.
Even when they try to have us not be, right? Like even when they try to have us not be. What's your best advice for somebody who's new and just starting to learn about fat advocacy? Your best advice or your best piece of information?
Boy. Ooh, that's a good one. I would say if you're new to fat advocacy work, two things. One, I already said it, I'll say it again, sign that NAAFA petition. That's an easy one. Two, I would say folks often get caught up in this idea that you need to like have like a TED talk ready. If you want to say anything about fatness and fat people, you got to know the whole history. You got to have everything all lined up before you have to do all of your learning, and then you can do all of your action. That's not how people work. And also, you don't have to do all your learning to be like, hey, that was kind of a dick move. Maybe knock it off, right? Or like, hey, I hope you don't talk about me that way when I'm not in the room, or whatever, right? And the other thing that I would say is it's really easy to overfocus on people who seem like the worst actors in the space, right? It's really easy to hyper focus on like Piers Morgan or Bill Maher, or like just like the endless parade of white dudes who are just like, no one's talking about how I'm not attracted to fat women. And you're like, great, okay, I guess. It's worth
cool
noting.
Story, bro.
Yeah, totally. Truly, no one asked. But I think in that we lose sight of two really important things. One that we lose sight of is there are a ton of people who are way more gettable than jerks on television, right? Or than the meanest person you know, right, to fat people. If we can shore up everybody else or a lot of other people, then the jerkiest person that you know will understand that at least their jerky behavior won't be tolerated, right?
Yeah.
But like actually like getting at the low-hanging fruit isn't like shying away from a challenge. It's actually shoring up numbers that are really helpful. And the other thing that I think folks lose sight of, it's very easy to think of anti-fatness, like so many forms of oppression, as like sometimes some individuals are mean to you, and those individuals should not be mean to you. As you were saying earlier, Tigress, people who think about this as like an interpersonal issue, folks lose sight of the systemic nature of it, and folks also lose sight of, in all of this sort of like combating anti-fatness, people think that the best way to show up is to like initiate a big argument. And like, I would just really urge folks to think about, if you're witnessing street harassment, if you're seeing someone get reseated or escorted off of a plane, if you're around when someone's being denied healthcare, any of that sort of stuff, think about what the fat person is going through first, right? That often we think about, oh, it would be really uncomfortable for this thin person to get called out for their nonsense, right? We don't think about what's the collective toll on fat folks of just experiencing this time and time and time again and not having anybody step up and say anything, right? So that's rangy on my part. but that's what I would say for new folks. How about you, Tigress? I feel like you engage with plenty of new folks.
One of the things I love about what you just said was the piece about like sort of like, I hope that's not how you talk about me when I'm not in the room. And one of the things that I think can be really useful is actually making that an actual question. Is that how you talk about me when I'm not in the room? Yes. Because it begs people to have to answer the question, even if they won't answer it with you.
Yeah.
Right. Even if they won't say honestly to you, the question can linger with them and they can like sort of follow them and make them really think about that. When it comes to sort of like any of the things that happen, if I were the person next to you on the bus that someone was yelling at for taking up too much space, would you do the same non-intervening thing that you're doing now that it's a stranger? Like if the lady in the grocery store that somebody's commenting on what's in their cart, like if it's me, if it's actually me, I think that's part of what moved people so much about um, the the sort of concept of your fat friend, right? Is it's like that might be me. I can forward this essay to somebody else because it is me, right? It is me when we're talking about it as me. So I do think like having some sort of prepared questions or like I know this is my go-to thing I say to stop somebody in their tracks or to make them pause and think about it. And like it's actually okay to practice some of those things. It's also okay to go back later and engage. I think this is something allies really don't know or like don't get it, that like you didn't say anything in the moment because you didn't realize until later. You didn't think about it till later. You didn't put your fat friend in that position until later. So then what do? Right? You don't have to just be like, well, that one's gone. Like you can go back to conversations, you can go back to things, you can go back to actions. And then I guess the other one is like think about what you can do in your own sphere, because yes, please sign our petition, please help us with work around legislation. You don't have to actually wait until legislation passes making it illegal to discriminate in the workplace before you go to your HR department and say, hey, do we have anything in our policies that says like, when we have that statement on the end of our applications that says who we don't discriminate against, does it include height and weight? Can we do something about that? We don't have to wait until the federal government does something about that to do that in some of our own local spaces. And I have to stop and think about that myself sometimes, Like, what about my own people? What am I doing with my own people?
Totally. HR, can we knock it off with our annual like biggest loser competition? Can we just not, right?
Yes.
Like there's like so many things all around us. And I think it can be kind of brain breaking, right? For folks who are sort of new to thinking about anti-fatness as like a pervasive and structural force, right? But once you start seeing it, you can also see all of those things that start popping up to you as being like profoundly anti-fat. Those are all also things that you can influence and change, right?
Yeah. I think we certainly can't get to all the questions that we have left. So I think I'm gonna give you one more and then we'll give you a chance for any final thoughts. If we didn't get to your question today, we are recording them and we'll share them with Aubrey. And then of course, we will invite Aubrey back for a round 2 of conversation after more of y'all have seen the movie as it goes online this month and all over the world in real life. I'm gonna combine a couple of questions that have to do with your influences. One person says, when people ask me for resources, I send them to you. Where do you point people? And somebody else says, who are some of the people who shaped you around what you know now about fat?
Yeah, I would say the big one for me, there were 3, I will say. Sonia Renee Taylor and The Body Is Not an Apology, maybe even more her poetry than even her books, which are great. You should go get them and read them. They're incredible. A huge influence. I would say Roxane Gay, just in terms of her, extremely kind of warts and all approach to trying to navigate living in the world in a body that is consistently like a moving sort of political target, right? Is really incredible. And I would say Leslie Kinzel, who wrote the book Two Whole Cakes, is absolutely extraordinary. And I will absolutely never forget, she wrote an open letter to Michelle Obama during the Let's Move campaign, which was the campaign to sort of end childhood obesity, quote unquote, right? War on fat kids, great. And she wrote about what it was like to be a fat kid who gets treated as a problem that needs solving, and like evidence of bad parenting and like evidence of bad schooling and all of that kind of stuff. Like, what does it mean as a child to be made a scapegoat for so many problems that belong to adults? That was one of the most sort of arresting pieces of writing I had read at that point, because it was like a level of vulnerability that I just felt like I wanted a lot more of. So I started making some more of it. I would say huge influences all around, all around.
Is there anybody else you want to mention, or any other places you want to mention as resources you like to send folks to?
Yes. If people are, I would say for advocacy work, I'd send folks to NAAFA reliably. If folks are in healthcare sort of worlds, I send folks to Reagan Chastain, who writes the Weight and Healthcare newsletter on Substack, and to ASDA, the Association of Size, Diversity, and Health, who are doing larger scale advocacy around healthcare for fat folks. If folks are in a legal world, if folks want to know about the law and that kind of stuff, I send them to Flair, which is sort of the legal arm of the movement. And there's a gigantic fat reading list on my website that is just like, here's the laundry list of every book you could possibly want. Here we go. I think in terms of shaping my own work, there have been some historians and political scientists and like bioethics people who have really gone in deep. I'm thinking of Eric Olson's book, Fat Politics, which sort of laid out a bunch about the sort of redefinition of disease and that kind of thing. Eric Oliver's a University of Chicago professor. Natalie Boero wrote a book called Killer Fat that is like absolutely incredible, indispensable. Yeah, there are just tons of folks who have sort of gone back through the public record and constructed these sort of reconstructed these histories of these kind of decision points where we decide what to do with fat people and sort of who's fat enough to be considered fat and what are the repercussions for having a particular kind of body and all of that kind of stuff. That stuff is immensely helpful and formative.
Aubrey, do you have any final thoughts or anything we didn't ask you about that you wish we had asked you today?
Nothing that I wished you had asked me. I feel like again, when you and I get together, it's like once every 6 months, and it's like 3 to 8 hours. That's how it goes. So
I know we're gonna have a telethon. Like, it's gonna be the NAAFA telethon. It's gonna be Aubrey and Tigress talk for 9 hours while you give pledges.
Totally. That's right. No, just
couple of belly dancers
for having me, and huge thanks to you and to all of the folks at NAAFA for the incredible work that you all are doing. That's my main message, is go watch the movie, but also please do everything you can to support NAAFA, because this is a huge lift, and as many folks as possible will make it lighter and lighter as we go.
Well, we always appreciate the support that you give us. More than anyone else, your followers actually activate when you tell them to activate. And so
really, that's great.
Yeah, we see. I was joking with my team the other day about how like the Aubrey Gordon effect in NAAFA is like the John Oliver effect in the world, like where like you say a thing for them to do and they do it. So Aubrey told y'all to give us money and sign our petition. I'm just saying, like,
yeah, Aubrey, I did say that. Please do that. Please give NAAFA money and sign their petition.
And again, you can find all of that stuff at our website, NAAFA.org. And Aubrey, one more time, where can they find you? Where can they find your film?
You can find me on Maintenance Phase, wherever podcasts are. You can get my books wherever books are, and you can watch the film at jolt.film starting on May 1st.
Hey!
Yay!
Thank you all for being with us today for the NAAFA Webinar Series. Especially thank you to you, Aubrey, and thanks to all of our donors who enable us to offer these webinars free of charge to fat community and all the supporters of fat folks. We appreciate you, and we'd like to keep offering these resources free of charge to our community. So please help us compensate the folks who are involved by supporting our work. And thank you once again to our friends and colleagues at Pro Bono ASL for providing interpreting today. Next up on the NAAFA Webinar Series, we are in the process of finalizing a webinar with Patrilia Hernandez related to food justice and intersections of fat liberation, and also with author and automobile experts Kaya Milstein, who's going to be coming on to talk to us about the new book that Ty is going to talk to us about the new book that they have out. So stay tuned for those. Get on our newsletter so you can learn about other things we have coming up. And we'll be excited to hopefully be having many of you join the NAAFA pod as monthly supporters. We'll see you next time, everyone. Take care.